Marcus Webb had fixed atmospheric processors on mining stations, cargo haulers, and even a luxury yacht belonging to a Martian industrialist with more money than sense. But he'd never worked on anything quite as intimidating as the environmental systems in an alien palace. The Kithaeron Royal Palace made every other building he'd serviced look like a maintenance shed, with its soaring crystalline spires and corridors that seemed to bend space itself to accommodate impossibly elegant architecture. He kept his toolkit close and his head down, trying to blend into the background while nobles from both human and Kithaeron territories swept past in their ceremonial finery. The coronation recess had filled the palace with enough diplomatic tension to power a small space station, and Marcus could feel it humming through the air recycling systems like an electrical current. Every conversation he overheard seemed to carry the weight of interstellar policy, and every glance between delegates suggested complex political calculations that were far above his pay grade. He much preferred the straightforward problems of mechanical systems. Atmospheric processors didn't have hidden agendas or delicate egos that needed constant management. His current assignment involved recalibrating the environmental controls in the East Wing, where the humidity levels had been fluctuating enough to make several human ambassadors complain about their hair frizzing. It was the kind of mundane technical problem that Marcus actually enjoyed solving, requiring nothing more than patience, precision, and a good understanding of thermodynamics. The palace's environmental systems were remarkably sophisticated, integrating Kithaeron bio-neural networks with human engineering in ways that should have been impossible but somehow worked beautifully. "Excuse me, are you authorized to be in this section?" The voice belonged to a palace guard whose armor incorporated enough defensive technology to stop a small asteroid, and whose expression suggested he viewed maintenance technicians as potential security threats. Marcus held up his work authorization pad, which displayed his credentials in both English and the flowing Kithaeron script that looked like mathematical poetry. Environmental systems calibration. The humidity controls in Corridor 7 are reading 3% outside acceptable parameters. The guard scanned the authorization with a device that probably cost more than Marcus's annual salary, then nodded curtly. "Proceed, but avoid the ceremonial areas. The prince's pre-coronation preparation is in progress." Marcus had no intention of going anywhere near ceremonial areas, since he'd learned from experience that important events and maintenance work mixed about as well as hydrogen and open flames. He returned to his atmospheric processor, running diagnostics on the humidity sensors and making minor adjustments to the air circulation patterns. The work was methodical and soothing, requiring enough concentration to block out the political undercurrents swirling through the palace. A soft chime from his equipment indicated that the recalibration was complete, and Marcus began packing his tools with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned that leaving equipment scattered around royal palaces was a good way to cause diplomatic incidents. The humidity levels were now stable at precisely 23.7%, which should keep both human and Kithaeron physiology comfortable without interfering with the delicate electronics that seemed to be embedded in every surface of the building. The corridor had grown quieter as the recess period continued, with most of the delegates presumably preparing for the next phase of the coronation ceremony. Marcus preferred it this way. Fewer people meant fewer opportunities for someone to decide that his presence constituted a security risk or a breach of protocol. He'd almost reached the service lift when the sound of running footsteps echoed through the hallway, growing rapidly closer with the particular rhythm that suggested someone small was moving very fast. The impact, when it came, caught him completely off guard. Something roughly the size and weight of a 7-year-old human child slammed into his legs with enough force to make him stagger, small arms wrapping around his knees with desperate strength. Marcus looked down to find himself face to face with what was clearly a young Kithaeron, whose pointed ears were trembling, and whose violet eyes were wide with unmistakable fear. The child's ceremonial robes were elaborate enough to suggest serious importance. Gold and silver threads, woven in patterns that probably had cultural significance Marcus couldn't even guess at. But the fine fabric was torn in several places, and the small hands gripping his coveralls were shaking with more than just physical exertion. This wasn't a game of hide-and-seek gone wrong. This was genuine terror. "Hey," Marcus said quietly, crouching down to bring himself closer to the child's eye level. "Are you okay? Are you hurt?" The young Kithaeron said something in his own language, the words tumbling out too fast for Marcus's limited translation software to process. But the tone was unmistakable. This was a frightened child asking for help from the nearest available adult. Heavy footsteps approached from the direction the child had come, and Marcus felt his stomach drop as he realized that several heavily armed palace guards were about to round the corner and find him in what would probably look like a very compromising situation. The child seemed to sense the approaching danger, pressing closer against Marcus's legs and looking up at him with an expression that mixed hope and desperation in equal measure. "Bad people," the child whispered in accented English, his voice barely audible. "They want to hurt Mama." The words hit Marcus like a surge from an overloaded power core. This wasn't just any Kithaeron child. This was Prince Kael, heir to the throne and the focus of today's coronation ceremony. And if he was running from bad people who wanted to hurt his mother, then Marcus had just found himself in the middle of what might be an assassination plot. The footsteps grew louder, and Marcus could hear voices calling in Kithaeron, their tone suggesting urgency that bordered on panic. He had perhaps 30 seconds to figure out how to explain why the crown prince was clinging to a human maintenance worker in a restricted corridor, and why the child seemed more afraid of his own guards than of a complete stranger with a toolkit full of potentially dangerous equipment. Prince Kael looked up at him with those enormous violet eyes and whispered something else in Kithaeron, a single word that Marcus's translation software managed to catch. "Sanctuary." The palace guards rounded the corner with the coordinated precision of a military unit, their energy weapons raised, and their facial expressions suggesting they were prepared for the worst possible scenario. Marcus felt Prince Kael press closer against his legs, the small body trembling with fear that was clearly not directed at the human stranger, but at the approaching Kithaeron security forces. This struck Marcus as fundamentally wrong. Children should feel safer when their protectors arrived, not more terrified. "Step away from the prince," the lead guard commanded in heavily accented English, his weapon trained on Marcus with the kind of steady aim that suggested extensive combat training. "Place your hands where we can see them and move slowly." Marcus raised his hands, trying to project the universal body language for harmless maintenance worker who definitely didn't kidnap anyone, while simultaneously wondering how his peaceful morning of humidity calibration had transformed into what appeared to be a hostage situation. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," he said carefully. "The prince ran into me. I was just trying to help." "The prince does not require assistance from unauthorized personnel," another guard stated, though Marcus noticed that none of them had actually moved to retrieve the child, who was still clinging to his coveralls with the determination of someone who had made a deliberate choice about whom to trust. Prince Kael said something in rapid Kithaeron that made the guards exchange uncertain glances, their weapons lowering slightly as they processed whatever the child had told them. Marcus caught fragments through his translation software, something about wrong voices and not safe, and what sounded like a very firm declaration that he was staying exactly where he was. "What did he say?" Marcus asked, though he suspected that asking questions while standing in the middle of what might be a royal security crisis was probably not his smartest move. The lead guard's expression shifted from aggressive suspicion to something more like confusion. "He claims you are his chosen sanctuary. This is unprecedented." "Sanctuary?" Marcus looked down at the young prince, who was gazing up at him with an intensity that seemed far too mature for someone who couldn't be older than 7 or 8. I don't understand what that means. It means, came a new voice from down the corridor, that my son has just invoked one of our oldest laws. Queen Lyrelei approached with the fluid grace that Marcus had seen in documentary footage, but which was far more impressive in person. Her ceremonial robes seemed to shimmer with embedded technology, and her pointed ears were twitching with the rapid micro-movements that indicated heavy neural communication traffic. She was beautiful in the way that made Marcus suddenly very aware of his grease-stained coveralls, and the fact that he probably smelled like industrial lubricants. The guards immediately shifted to defensive positions around their queen, though Marcus noticed they were still maintaining their distance from both him and the prince. Whatever chosen sanctuary meant in Kithaeron law, it was apparently serious enough to make heavily armed palace security hesitate before intervening. "Your Majesty," Marcus said, because addressing alien royalty probably required some form of protocol even when you had no idea what you were doing. "I think your son might be in some kind of trouble. He seems scared of his own guards." Queen Lyrelei's violet eyes, so similar to her son's, studied Marcus with an intensity that made him feel like she was reading his complete psychological profile. Indeed, and his choice of sanctuary is most illuminating. Prince Kael spoke again in Kithaeron, his voice gaining confidence as he explained something to his mother in great detail. The queen's expression grew increasingly serious as she listened, her pointed ears now twitching with what Marcus was beginning to recognize as the Kithaeron equivalent of deep concern. "He says that several of his usual guards have been replaced with people he doesn't recognize," she translated, her voice carefully controlled, "and that he overheard conversations about removing obstacles to the succession." Marcus felt cold wash through his system like a coolant leak. Someone's planning to assassinate you during the coronation. It would appear so. The queen gestured to the guards surrounding them, and Marcus noticed that their positions had shifted again, now facing outward to watch the corridors rather than focusing on him. The question becomes how to verify which of our security personnel can be trusted. "What does the sanctuary thing mean, exactly?" Marcus asked, because if he was going to be involved in preventing a royal assassination, he probably needed to understand the legal implications. "By choosing you as his sanctuary, my son has temporarily placed himself under your protection according to ancient Kithaeron law," Queen Lyrelei explained. "This grants you certain authorities until the perceived threat is resolved." "What kind of authorities?" "The kind that allow you access to palace security systems and biometric databases," she said, with what might have been amusement if the situation weren't quite so serious. "Essentially, you have just become a provisional member of the royal household." Marcus stared at her. "I'm a maintenance technician. I fix air conditioning systems." "And apparently you also inspire confidence in frightened children," the queen observed, "which, in our current circumstances, may be a more valuable skill than you realize." Prince Kael tugged on Marcus's coveralls and pointed down the corridor, speaking earnestly in his mixture of Kithaeron and broken English. Marcus caught words like "wrong faces" and "not smell right," and something that sounded like technical specifications for biometric scanners. "He's trying to tell us something about the security verification systems," Marcus said, his engineering background helping him parse the child's fragmented technical observations. "I think he noticed that some of the guards don't match their usual biometric signatures." Queen Lyrelei's eyes widened slightly. "Of course. A child would be more likely to notice changes in familiar people than adults who are focused on broader security concerns." "Can we access the biometric logs?" Marcus asked, then realized he was casually discussing palace security with alien royalty. "I mean, assuming I actually have these temporary authorities you mentioned." "You do indeed." The queen activated a holographic interface that materialized in the air between them. "And given the circumstances, I believe a comprehensive review of our security personnel would be most illuminating." Marcus found himself looking at scrolling lists of biometric data that would have been completely incomprehensible 20 minutes ago, but which now represented the difference between successful assassination and successful prevention of assassination. Prince Kale continued to cling to his legs, occasionally pointing at specific entries and making comments that suggested the child had been paying far more attention to palace security than anyone had realized. "This is either going to save your lives," Marcus said, studying the data streams, "or get us all killed by whoever's been infiltrating your security forces." "Those appear to be our options," Queen Lyrale agreed. "Shall we proceed?" The palace's central courtyard had been transformed into an impromptu security command center, with holographic displays showing biometric data, guard rotation schedules, and real-time locations of every person currently within the royal complex. Marcus found himself at the center of it all, still wearing his maintenance coveralls and still serving as Prince Kale's chosen anchor point, while Queen Lyrale coordinated what was rapidly becoming a counterintelligence operation. "The discrepancies are significant," she announced, highlighting several entries in the security database. 12 guards assigned to the coronation ceremony show biometric variations that suggest they are not the individuals they claim to be. Captain Thorne, the human security liaison, had gone through several color changes since arriving at the courtyard and was now approximately the shade of recycled protein paste. "How is that possible? We verified all personnel through both human and Kitharan security protocols. Apparently someone found ways to circumvent both systems," Marcus observed, studying the data with the methodical approach he usually reserved for diagnosing faulty equipment. "Look at these timing patterns. The biometric substitutions all occurred during shift changes over the past 3 weeks. Someone's been systematically replacing your security personnel." Prince Kale, who had finally released his death grip on Marcus's coveralls but remained within arm's reach, pointed at one of the displays and spoke rapidly in Kitharan. The translation software caught fragments about "smell different and walk wrong," and "eyes not kind." "He's been noticing these changes for days," Queen Lyrale translated, her voice tight with what Marcus was learning to recognize as controlled Kitharan anger. "Children are remarkably observant about details adults tend to overlook. The question is whether this is a Kitharan conspiracy, a human conspiracy, or some kind of joint operation," Captain Thorne said, his hand hovering near his sidearm as he studied the assembled security personnel with new suspicion. "Based on the infiltration patterns, I'd say joint operation," Marcus replied, then paused as he realized everyone was staring at him. "What? I'm good with patterns. It's part of the job when you're troubleshooting complex systems." The Queen activated another display, showing communication logs and financial records that made Marcus whistle softly. "Someone's been very well funded. These payments trace back to extremist factions on both sides, humans who want to restart the war and Kitharans who believe peace with your species is impossible. They're using the coronation as cover for eliminating the royal family and blaming it on the other side," Marcus concluded, his engineer's mind automatically working through the logical sequence. "Create an incident that destroys the peace process and gives both extremist groups what they want." Prince Kale tugged on his coveralls again and pointed toward the main ceremonial hall, where preparations for the coronation were continuing despite the security crisis. The child spoke urgently, and Marcus caught words that made his blood run cold. "He says there are explosives," he translated, his voice sharp with alarm, "hidden in the ceremonial equipment." Queen Lyrale's pointed ears went completely still, a sign that Marcus was learning indicated extreme focus or extreme danger. That would explain why they needed to position personnel throughout the security network, not just for assassination, but for a complete destruction of the coronation ceremony. "How much time do we have?" Captain Thorne asked, already moving toward his communication equipment. Marcus looked at the chronometer display floating above them. The main ceremony begins in 40 minutes. If they're planning to detonate during the crucial moments, we probably have 30 minutes to find and disable whatever they've planted. And to identify which of our security personnel are actually trying to kill us, the Queen added grimly. Prince Kale said something else, his young voice carrying a note of urgency that transcended language barriers. Marcus found himself automatically crouching down to the child's level, a gesture that seemed to encourage more detailed explanation. He's trying to tell us where he saw them placing things, Marcus realized. The fake guards. He watched them accessing areas they shouldn't have been able to reach. Queen Lyrelei activated the palace's complete architectural system, displaying a three-dimensional map that showed every room, corridor, and service area in the massive complex. "Show us, little one." The prince moved to the display with the confidence of someone who had spent his entire life exploring every corner of his home. He pointed to specific locations, speaking rapidly, while Marcus and the Queen tried to follow his directions through the maze of the palace's interior. "Service tunnels," Marcus said, recognizing the pattern. "They've been using maintenance access points to move around undetected. Smart. Most security systems don't monitor service areas as heavily as public spaces." "Can you access those areas?" Queen Lyrelei asked. Marcus held up his toolkit. "I have authorization for all environmental system maintenance zones, which includes pretty much everywhere that connects to the building's infrastructure." "Then we have our approach vector." The Queen began issuing orders in Kithaeron to the guards who had been verified as genuine, while Captain Thorne coordinated with the human security contingent that hadn't been compromised. "Teams of 3, 1 human, 1 Kithaeron, and you as our expert on palace maintenance systems. I should mention that I've never actually looked for explosives before," Marcus pointed out. "My experience with dangerous devices pretty much ends at overcharged power cores." Prince Kale looked up at him with those enormous violet eyes and said something that sounded like encouragement, patting Marcus's arm with small hands that conveyed surprising confidence. "He says you smell like truth," Queen Lyrelei translated, her expression softening slightly despite the crisis, "and that the bad people smell like lies." Marcus found himself smiling despite the circumstances. "Well, I've certainly never been accused of smelling like lies. I guess that's something." The chronometer updated, showing 37 minutes remaining until the coronation ceremony. Somewhere in the palace, unknown numbers of infiltrators were preparing to destroy everything both civilizations had worked to build. And Marcus, who had started the day planning to recalibrate humidity sensors, was now responsible for preventing an interstellar incident. "Right," he said, checking his equipment and making sure his authorization codes were active. "Let's go find some explosives." Dawn broke over the Kithaeron palace as Marcus found himself in what had to be the most surreal situation of his career. Wearing ceremonial robes over his maintenance coveralls, while Prince Kale explained the finer points of explosive device identification to a joint human Kithaeron security team. The past 12 hours had transformed him from anonymous technician to provisional royal guardian, and he still wasn't entirely sure how that had happened. The resonance frequencies were all wrong, the young prince was saying in his mixture of languages, pointing to the disabled devices they'd found hidden throughout the ceremonial hall. "Papa taught me about harmonic systems before he died, and these things made angry music." Marcus translated, though he suspected the security team was beginning to understand Prince Kale's unique technical vocabulary. "He's talking about the acoustic signatures from the timing mechanisms. Kithaeron children apparently receive a more comprehensive engineering education than most human adults." Queen Lyrelei smiled with a mixture of maternal pride and relief as she watched her son demonstrate his knowledge to fascinated security personnel. The conspiracy had unraveled quickly once they'd started following the prince's observations. Infiltrated guards, planted explosives, and a coordinated plan that would have eliminated the royal family while making it look like human treachery. The tribunals will be processing conspirators for months, she said, reviewing the arrest records on her personal display. Both human and Kithaeron extremist factions, working together while publicly claiming to hate each other. It's actually kind of brilliant, Marcus admitted, making final adjustments to the environmental systems that had been damaged during the explosive removal process. Create a false flag operation that gives both sides exactly what they think they want: renewed conflict and the end of peace negotiations. Captain Thorne approached with the satisfied expression of someone who had successfully prevented an interstellar incident before his morning coffee. The last of the infiltrators have been detained. Both governments are expressing their gratitude for your unconventional, investigative methods. Unconventional. Marcus looked down at his ceremonial robes, which had been hastily modified to accommodate his tool belt. I was just following standard troubleshooting procedures. Identify the problem, trace it to its source, and fix it before it breaks something important. In this case, something important was the peace process between two civilizations, the Queen observed. I believe that qualifies as significant technical achievement. Prince Kale had finished his security briefing and returned to Marcus's side, though he was no longer clinging with the desperate fear of the previous day. Instead, he seemed to have appointed himself as Marcus's cultural advisor, occasionally correcting his pronunciation of Kithaeron technical terms and offering suggestions for improving the palace's environmental efficiency. He wants to know if you'll stay to help with the coronation ceremony, Queen Lyreley translated after another rapid exchange in Kithaeron. Apparently, he has concerns about the atmospheric pressure levels in the main hall. Marcus checked his readings, noting that the prince was absolutely correct about the pressure differential. The ceremonial hall does need some adjustments. All that security equipment we brought in has changed the air circulation patterns. Then perhaps you would consider extending your assignment, the Queen suggested. The Kithaeron government would be pleased to offer you a permanent position as a cultural liaison and technical advisor. What would that involve exactly? Primarily ensuring that our environmental systems continue to function properly, she replied with a slight smile, and occasionally preventing assassination attempts, though we hope the latter responsibility will become less frequent. Prince Kale tugged on Marcus's robes and pointed toward the ceremonial hall, where delegates were beginning to assemble for the rescheduled coronation. He spoke earnestly, and Marcus's translation software caught something about proper celebration and making sure the air tastes right for important occasions. He takes environmental quality very seriously, Marcus noted. He takes everything seriously. It comes with being raised to eventually command star fleets. Queen Lyreley activated her ceremonial regalia, the embedded circuits creating patterns of light that probably had deep cultural significance. Though I suspect his experience with human engineering perspectives will serve him well when he assumes the throne. The coronation ceremony proceeded without explosions, assassination attempts, or environmental system failures. Prince Kale, now wearing freshly repaired ceremonial robes, performed his ritual duties with the gravity of someone who had learned important lessons about responsibility and trust. Marcus watched from a position that was technically part of the royal household, still trying to process how his quiet life of fixing atmospheric processors had evolved into something that apparently warranted its own diplomatic classification. 6 months later, he stood in his new workshop, a sophisticated facility that combined human engineering principles with Kithaeron bioneural technology, reviewing environmental reports for the newly expanded cultural exchange program. His official title was Senior Technical Advisor for Interspecies Environmental Systems, though Prince Kale usually just called him the person who makes sure the air works properly. The prince had grown several inches and gained considerable confidence, though he still insisted on inspecting Marcus's work whenever palace systems needed maintenance. His technical questions had become more sophisticated, and his ability to spot problems that adults missed remained remarkably sharp. "Marcus," came the familiar voice from the workshop entrance, speaking in the crisp English that Prince Kale had been perfecting. "Mother says the new embassy building has irregular humidity patterns in the diplomatic suites. She thinks you should investigate before the ambassadors' meeting next week." Marcus looked up from his current project, a hybrid life support system designed for mixed human-Kithaeron crews on joint exploration missions. Irregular how? The kind of irregular that might indicate someone's been modifying the environmental controls for unauthorized purposes. The prince replied with the casual expertise of someone who had learned to think like both an engineer and a security advisor. Marcus saved his work and reached for his toolkit.